Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday, the 27th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ron DeSantis becoming the first ever major presidential candidate to announce their run on social media. Home Secretary Suella Braverman in the spotlight over her handling of a speeding offence, and the death of pop and rock icon Tina Turner at the age of 83. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine. We're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is the boss man Holden Frith, from Hong Kong, broadcaster and lecturer Abdulwahab Tahhan, and won't somebody think of the children from the Week Junior, it's Felicity Capon. Abdul, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is adding warning labels on alcohol worth the shot?
This will be a world first. Ireland is the first country that is doing this. I'm in Geneva at the World Health Assembly, and it's supported by the World Health Organization. There are a lot of other countries watching in, and what I anticipate is actually this is going to become the norm, much like other warnings previously.
Irish Health Minister Stephen Donnelly speaking to RTE on Monday. Abdul, what's he talking about? What's going to become the norm?
So the norm is the new rules that have been approved by Ireland that will be introduced in 3 years, which will require alcohol companies and bars to add warning labels on the alcohol that will show the danger of drinking alcohol and would show the calorie count on these drinks, because they think that they will give consumers a better options and have them more informed about the danger of alcohol.
Okay, why has Ireland pushed for more regulation in this space, do you think?
Well, Ireland is pushing for more regulation because, according to the World Health Organization, 70% of Irishmen and 34% of women over the age of 15 have a hazardous relationship with alcohol. And that's a very high number. According to a survey by Health Ireland, 79% were not aware that drinking alcohol might cause breast cancer, and 7% believed it was safe to drink small amount of alcohol while pregnant. These are very, very big numbers and have catastrophic results. So I think Ireland was like, hey, wait a second. We need to make sure that people are aware of these dangers, just like smoking.
Well, that's it, isn't it, Felicity? Is it just like smoking? I mean, obviously, pregnancy is almost kind of an extreme example. Lots of things can affect you in pregnancy. But outside of that, smoking a cigarette can increase your chances of cancer. There are benefits to drinking a glass of red wine. It's about drinking it in excess, isn't it? So is it the same? Should there be labels like on cigarette packets?
Yeah, I don't think it is comparable to smoking and to also spirits and binge drinking spirits particularly. And I think that it's caused a huge kind of diplomatic spat across the continent, because obviously Italy and Spain and France and the big exporters of wine are very unhappy about it. And I mean, obviously, cynically, you can see why they'd be unhappy about it, because potentially if more countries adopted this, it could affect sales. But, they're saying that Ireland's got this all wrong, and actually it's about drinking in moderation and not binge drinking.
Yeah, but they wouldn't be happy with that on the label either, would they? Drink this in moderation.
but the comparison to smoking is a good one, because I think Ireland was the first country back in 2004, I think, that banned smoking in public places, including in pubs, and sort of see themselves as a bit of a leader on public health issues like that. And so I think they want to be seen as a leader on this again, and for other countries to follow suit. I can't see that types of people who are going into restaurants and ordering a nice bottle of red to share a celebration are the ones who are also forming the statistics of the alcoholism problem. So it does seem quite stark, and yeah, I think it's different to smoking and to consumption of spirits, I'd say.
Yeah. Holden, what does this tell us about how Ireland sees themselves? do you think? Do you agree with Felicity? This is kind of just about them self-defining in a way? Because it sort of feels a bit like something you'd more expect Sweden or Iceland or New Zealand to do, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder if it is part of the huge transition that Ireland has made over the past sort of 30 years or so of, going from a country that was very poor, very religiously dominated, and perhaps lived up to some of the stereotypes that tended to be imposed on it, including, of course, high prevalence of alcohol consumption. And clearly Ireland's changed dramatically since the 80s, since joining the EU. It's become a great deal more wealthy, a great deal more socially liberal, a lot more forward-looking, and perhaps this is part of that change in the way it wants to self-define, and perhaps it does actually want to be associated more like those sort of Scandinavian countries that you mentioned, and less like a part of the old world that's stuck in its own history.
I mean, debates around this, Abdul, kind of really come down to people either saying, well, if you educate people, then they have choice about whether they consume the product. So it's almost like a libertarian move to slap a warning on it so they can make an informed choice and then do whatever they want. And people who say, no, this is the nanny state. I don't need the government telling me what's good and bad for me. I can research that myself if I want to. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think it's very interesting to see where you look at where you stand in here. It has a relationship with your age, how old you are, because things are changing with Gen Z. We talk a lot about Gen Z, and usually we criticize them for a lot of things, but actually we have to give them this, because according to a survey, Gen Z are drinking less than boomers and less than the generations before. A study in 2019 showed that those between 16 and 25 years old drink less, with 26% of them are teetotal. They don't drink at all, compared to 15% of the population aged between 55 and 74 who are teetotal, who don't drink.
Well, they've made that choice without the government helping them along, though, haven't they? So, is it necessary to put this label on bottles?
It helps. It definitely helps. And if I could push it more, I would like to see some graphic photos on alcohol, just like cigarettes, because these graphic photos, according to anecdotal evidence, helps people quit smoking. And when they see these photos, a lot of people that I know, not a lot, small number of them, that decided to quit smoking, but because they had some options, they went into vaping. So I think using some graphic photos on alcohol to show people the effect of alcohol and raise awareness is really important. At the end of the day, they're not forcing people.
But that is the extreme effect of alcohol, isn't it? That is the extreme effect of alcohol. It's not, isn't that equivalent to putting a morbidly obese person on a bar of dairy milk? It doesn't. If you have a square of chocolate, you're not going to become morbidly obese. It's if you eat too much of it.
Yeah, but this is an addictive substance. You can get addictive, and if 7% of the people don't think that drinking alcohol has effect on pregnancy, then it's really bad. So I think awareness is really needed in here, and if this could help, this would be awesome. At the end of the day, the government does not force anyone to read. It's just force the manufacturer to add these things.
Where do you stand on it, Felicity?
I don't think it's fair, really. I don't like the move away from moderation to abstinence. I think it is a bit of a nanny state, sort of telling people, and maybe scaremongering, even the pregnancy. I think I would probably disagree on that. I would say that you can drink. I think most women I know who've been pregnant have had the odd drink here and there, and I think they object to the sort of stigmatization and the demonization of drinking any alcohol.
There's stigma and then there's science, isn't there? So yeah, you don't want to stigmatize pregnant women who will occasionally lapse and have a drink and say they're doing something evil. On the other hand, you do want to say, but the science says even a drink is harmful potentially. I mean, those two things can be true, can't they?
Yeah, they can be. But I mean, I think it's, without going off on a tangent, I mean, there are lots of things to do with pregnancy that you're not supposed to eat, and you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And actually, when you dig down into the data that's available and the stats that are available, I just think the NHS will always be cautious and say, don't drink, don't eat sushi, don't do this, because it's not really in their interest to say it's fine if you have a bit of this every now and again. So even the sort of the diagram of the pregnant women and a big like cross out with the wine in her hand, I'm not really in favor of that. And I also think if you know how to drink in moderation, which I'm sure people on the continent know how to do a lot better than
the Irish.
UK does, and maybe Ireland does. Yeah,
I could feel you hesitating whether to say that.
I'm married to an Irishman, so I'm allowed. But yeah, without falling into dangerous stereotypes, if you know how to drink in moderation and you have a sort of a healthy understanding, I think, to go into a restaurant or a pub and see these really graphic images when you just want to have a pint on a Friday night or something, I don't really like it.
That's interesting, isn't it, Holden, how this might roll out on the continent? We heard in the clip there, clearly the health minister feels that Ireland's going to be the first, but everyone's going to follow. I mean, in Italy and Spain, countries like that, Mediterranean diet, wine is such a fundamental cultural bonding agent. It's almost unthinkable to imagine a warning like this on a bottle of wine in France or in Italy, isn't it? And actually, they don't have the same issues with binge drinking, but the health issues are still there. If you're drinking wine every day, it's probably not that good for you. If you're drinking more than a glass, it probably isn't that good for you.
I think the difficulty is in conveying that sort of message, because there is, I think there probably is a broader picture here. If you look at the areas of Italy which have very high life expectancy, people are drinking wine, they're drinking it in moderation, they're also eating very good diets, they're probably enjoying themselves, and enjoying yourself, I'm sure, has a positive effect on not only quality of life, but how long you're going to live. It's just that it is quite hard to quantify and reduce into statistics. And I think that there is a bit of a risk of a sort of leveling effect if you put health warnings on everything. And we started off with the comparison with smoking. And if you put the sort of warning symbols you were talking about, Olly, of on foods that might cause heart attacks as well, there is a risk that you just end up saying that everything is in danger of shortening your life, and then people don't kind of quantify things in the correct way and think, oh well, if all of this is dangerous, then I may as well smoke as well as drink and eat the occasional ice cream.
You minimize the warnings on smoking.
Yeah, and you lose the sort of shock effect if it's I remember seeing a warning sign walking into Disneyland in California on the kind of entrance archway where it's sort of welcome to the Magic Kingdom, and then underneath that in slightly smaller letters something like the state of California requires you to know that this premises contains construction materials known to cause cancer. And I don't know if I've ever seen two messages more at odds with each other, and that's information that you cannot do anything with. I suppose you could just turn around and decide not to go, but it's more about disclaiming than it is actually giving you useful, actionable information. And I think there's a risk that this might look a bit like that if it's introduced in a thoughtless way.
Well, do you see it rolling out, Abdul? Do you think other countries will follow on?
I think yes, because, for example, in Arabic countries, we have non-alcoholic beers. And on the non-alcoholic beers, it says exactly how many calories there are. And it's sort of thing that, you go to gym and in the evening it's so hot, and then you get a non-alcoholic beer. And it's not gonna give you a beer belly because there's only very few alcohol calories in it, like I think 70 calories or something like this. So I think it's gonna catch up first with beer, especially beer light, and in the US and Australia, when a lot of people drink beer, I think, and then we'll catch up maybe in Sweden or places where people really care about how many calories they have.
I mean, interestingly, Holden, this has been done inside the EU. That's another facet to this, isn't it? Part of the British conversation about leaving the EU was, when you're in the EU, you're trapped in their regulations. Ireland are doing something that's obviously really annoying, Italy and Spain, but they're doing it anyway within the EU, and they're going to have their own bottles.
That's certainly their plan. There is some suggestion that the EU might intervene to stop them, actually, and Italy is among the countries that has appealed to Brussels to launch I suppose effectively a kind of trade court dispute with Ireland. The Italian argument is that this is against single market rules because it's effectively imposing different labelling regulations within one part of the EU. And apparently the EU is planning a broader approach to alcohol labelling, which it would then impose across the EU. So there's a chance either that Ireland is forced to put a stop to this, which the Irish government says it definitely won't do, or that the EU ends up adopting something very similar and forcing Italy and everyone else to follow suit, which I presume the Italian government will be equally unhappy with.
Do you think it will come here, Felicity?
No, I can't see that happening. But just to add to Holden's point, it's also the case that the labels won't be on Irish exports of whiskey or Guinness or other drinks, which I think is also part of the row within the single market rules, is that Ireland.
Well, the Ireland's being hypocritical.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, because they're not going to put the labels on the stuff that they're selling to other countries in
It's
Europe.
for export. The countries they're exporting to don't have those rules. That would be weird for them to put their own rules on it. I mean, what is weird is that we don't know. Anyone who drinks alcohol in this country often doesn't know what's inside the bottle. I mean, I do find that bizarre. That is something that, forgetting about the warnings, but just the ingredients, I think you only have to list them on non-alcoholic beers, as Abdul was saying, and that it's basically optional to add them on alcoholic beverages. What's that about? I want to know what's in it.
I don't.
Fair enough.
Just knock it back.
The other bit of the rules that I do like is the labels would have to tell you how much alcohol in grams there is, which I think is much clearer than percentages, because the percent, if you were trying to work out what you are consuming, trying to do maths in a pub as the volume you've consumed increases gets harder and harder. But I think maybe that is more useful information, that you could just, if you had a sense of what each drink contained, then you would be able to make a clearer decision on what you wanted to consume and in what form.
I think also it's worth pointing out that in countries, particularly France, there's been a real decrease in young people drinking anyway. And I just wonder whether it could be a sort of, among the younger generation, a move to greater self-regulation without needing these kind of really stark, grim warnings with, as Abdul was saying, the kind of rise of non-alcoholic beverages going up and more teetotalers. Particularly in France, I think the number of young people who drink wine has dramatically slumped, which may be part of the reason why they're so upset about Ireland's new regulations. But one of the things they did point out, which I thought was really interesting, is that meals aren't structured so much anymore in countries like France, and also the rise in single parent families means that when there was a sort of a bigger family unit, you'd all sit down and have a bottle of wine, and that's no longer happening. So I just wonder whether organically and naturally younger people are turning away from drinking huge amounts.
Yeah, seeing the decline in the cheese course as well, which is the real tragedy in my view. Okay, Holden, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Holden, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why you really should care what the weatherman says.
Here in the west and the northwest, cannot repeat the advice often enough from the Gardaí. Don't make unnecessary journeys. Don't take risks on treacherous roads. And don't swim in the sea. Incredibly, people have been spotted in the water here in Blackrock and Salthill, both today and yesterday.
Theresa Mannion reporting for RTE there during Storm Desmond in Ireland back in 2015. Holden, comedy gold, that video clip, but what's the story this week?
Well, it is a slightly more serious story, although it's a story that has some good news attached to it. The bad news, though, I'm afraid, is pretty grim. A report published by the World Meteorological Organization on Monday revealed that more than 2 million people have died because of extreme weather since 1970. The better news is that the number of deaths has declined very sharply during that period, dropping from 667,000 in the 1980s to 184,000 in the 2010s.
The number of deaths due to extreme weather.
That's right, yeah.
So what kind of deaths are we talking about there? I mean, obviously storms is, I guess, people's houses falling on them, that sort of thing.
Yeah, storms, flooding, extremes of heat that exacerbate, existing conditions like asthma, droughts, any kind of bad weather that leads to any sort of death that the World Meteorological Association has been able to tie down.
Okay. And so why do you think there has been this decrease in the amount of people dying? As you say, any number of people dying from extreme weather is not good. But why is the number seemingly improving?
Yeah, well, and having come down to a quarter of its peak as well, so a big drop. And that it's what it certainly isn't is a reduction in extreme weather. So the same report found that there are now 5 times as many extreme weather events than there were back when they started recording this. So it's more that we're getting better at coping with what the weather is throwing at us. And there's a few reasons for that. One is just generally we have more accurate weather forecasting. And specifically, we're getting better at developing early warning systems using those forecasts and using them more widely, particularly for storms and flooding. But at the same time, we've also got better at disaster management. So when disaster does strike, we can save more lives. And that improvement has particularly benefited poorer parts of the world, which are still the most likely to be suffering high death tolls after natural disasters, but not to anything like the catastrophic extent that they were.
Yeah, but being alive is not the same as having a high quality of life, is it, Abdul? And this is something you've talked about on your immigration podcast. You know, people migrate to escape extreme weather, but they're still having a pretty torrid time.
Yeah, totally. I can see the numbers and the logic in Holden's argument, but unfortunately, it's not only about the heat and weather conditions. It's about the corruption and where you live. If you're living in a developing country, it's more likely you're going to get hit, even if you have early warning system. Like if you're living in a place in a big camp and there's a warning that there's a heat wave. Sorry, what are you going to do? Double up the tent, put another tent. You cannot do anything. If there's a flooding, we see these happening every year, flooding and snowstorms. In Asia, accounting for 74% of all the death in worldwide because of natural disasters from 1970 until now. And it's because of the bad infrastructure they have and of a lot of corruption where people really don't care about investing in the infrastructure where people live. So these are not only poor country, but there's a lot of corruption happening in these countries and where people live. And even if they have warning systems, they wouldn't really work because nobody would care about those who die.
Yeah, the WMO, Holden, on the subject of those early warnings, wants high-quality early warnings of impending disasters to reach everyone on the planet by the end of 2027. How are they planning on doing that?
There's a few examples of how this has been done in, particularly in Asia, which is one of the areas which is sort of most afflicted by flooding and cyclones. I saw one case study in Kolkata in India, city which gets 1.8 meters of rain a year, and most of that falls during the monsoon, has 4 million people living in flood risk areas. So you can see why that would be a high priority for this kind of project. And since 2017, the Asia Development Bank has been working with the city government and local engineers, and it's a two-pronged approach really. One is a sort of longer-term project to look at city planning and land use to try and kind of minimize people living in those high-risk areas, and also look at how floodwaters are managed. But then in the shorter term, they have put 300 sensors around the city in key parts of the drainage network and in rivers and other water channels. And these sensors are connected via the internet to a control center, but also then to local residents' phones. So when there seem to be rising water levels, the first thing that happens is that pumping stations can kind of jump into action and start to try and kind of head off problems before they occur. But if those water levels keep rising, then people in the area will get an alert that will warn them to move somewhere else.
I mean, that must come at a cost, though, to those countries.
Yeah, that's really what the WMO is saying. It's saying governments, international bodies like the UN need to be investing more in these sorts of systems, and it's a significant amount of money in countries which don't necessarily have a huge amount of money to spare. But these are relatively small scale and relatively cheap when you're looking at high levels of infrastructure. And there is an economic benefit to being able to head off the worst effects of these disasters too.
But then where do you go back to, Abdul? You move upland, your home's been swept away. it's gone, right? There's no money to help you rebuild it.
Well, sometimes dying is better than being displaced, to be honest. From my experience, I don't know. But if you're a refugee, for example, and you get a, a message that, oh, your camp is about to be flooded, where do you go? You can't go to another camp. Where if the only hope is to depend on the UN and because your country is very corrupt. We're not talking about developed country, we're talking about developing country. And you need to depend on the UN. But then you see all these reports about the corruption inside the UN, where, for example, in Sudan, people employed in the UN to help refugees, they ask for money from people to give them humanitarian visa. In Syria, we see the reports coming from by The Guardian that Assad was getting millions from the UN to let them enter the country and do humanitarian work. So if these are the bodies that are going to lead the work in order to make everyone safer, how can a regular person living in developing country really have any hope that someone will care about them? Yes, this is a success and it's great for people living in Europe and for people who migrated to richer countries, but for poorer countries where corruption, rules, I don't think there's any hope, to be honest.
I think I would disagree slightly with that, just because the statistics here show that the biggest advances actually have been in developing countries. Now, that's partly because richer countries were already better at handling these sorts of situations, so had lower death tolls already in the 70s. And it's not to say that there aren't still really big problems and that it's always going to be the poorest in the world who are most affected when natural disaster strikes. But I think it is important not to overlook or understate the really significant progress that has been made in the world's poorest countries dealing with these sorts of things. And, there are many hundreds of thousands of people alive in those countries who wouldn't be if it hadn't been for these changes in the way that we are able to react to natural disasters.
But the further problem, Felicity, is that extreme weather events are increasing. So even if we've got to a stage now where kind of miraculously human ingenuity has lowered the risk, maybe with ever increasing issues from climate change, we're never going to better that position, but the events are going to come thicker and faster.
Yeah, I agree that I think we are probably always going to be playing catch up to some degree. I think there is a glimmer of hope in this story that there are ways of saving people, notifying them sooner, more technological innovation going on. But I agree that we have to adapt now. I don't think climate change is a story about how do we prevent it happening, or how do we stop the planet from getting warmer. It is getting warmer. I don't really think we can prevent it. It's now more about mitigation, isn't it? And learning how do we live, how do we exist in this world. And that's things like flooding defenses, or as Holden was talking about, infrastructure, all that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I agree. This is not a sort of a good news story for climate change. That's only going to get worse. It's the only good thing about this is that if we can save lives against all odds of living in a hotter world, that is something.
Yeah, the reason I brought this story is not because I think it means that everything will be fine and we don't need to do all of the other things like electrifying the economy and then or at the same time decarbonizing electricity. But it's just that as well as doing all of that, which is going to take time, we're also going to have to take defensive actions. And I also think we're much more likely to galvanize ourselves to do that and build the tools and systems we'll need to enable us to do that if we do understand that they really do save lives. And so it's worth investing the money in both that long-term change in the way we live and also the slightly shorter-term things that are going to allow us to get to that point in the first place.
Okay. Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is applying for university more about knowing your place than getting a place?
Mr. Speaker, Winchester College has a rowing club, a rifle club, an extensive art collection. They charge over £45,000 a year in fees. Why did he hand them nearly £6 million of taxpayers' money this year in what his Levelling Up Secretary calls egregious state support?
Mr. Speaker, whenever he attacks me about where I went to school, he is attacking the hard-working aspiration of millions of people in this country. He's attacking people like my parents, Mr. Speaker. This is a country that believes in opportunity, not resentment. He doesn't understand that, and that's why he's not fit to lead.
Bit of good old-fashioned class war there in PMQs back in 2022. Keir Starmer versus Rishi Sunak. Felicity, what's the story this week?
So this is an opinion piece in The Guardian written by Frances Ryan. It's quite tongue-in-cheek, and she's based it on new research that shows that private school pupils in the UK are up to a third more likely to get into Cambridge University if they move to a state sixth form. So there's a little bit of social engineering going on, I think, from some tiger parents who, but it's sort of saying that students who stayed at private schools for their A-levels, they had an acceptance rate of 19% last year. But those who moved from a fee-paying school to a grammar school or a sixth form college had a success rate of about 25%.
The suggestion really is that people who have paid for their children to have a private education for perhaps 10, 12 years, then at the last minute descend and move them to their local state comp so that they can get into Cambridge. That really is happening?
To some degree. I mean, when you look at the numbers, it's not like thousands and thousands. I don't think it's, I mean, it is definitely happening, and it does seem like the numbers are increasing, but I mean, it's not huge numbers, but, and we don't have equivalent data for Oxford, who they haven't released theirs, but a few other universities have, and it certainly seems that there is some sort of trend that suggests that in a boost to get more state school pupils into the top universities, parents are up to a bit of their own sort of social engineering to get their kids in.
Okay, so maybe, Holden, this is something that's happening on the fringes, but what it really means is that finally, after like 30 years of discussing this, Cambridge and presumably Oxford as well, although we haven't got their stats, have made inroads in having a more representative number of state school pupils in their intake. That has to be good, doesn't it?
I would say so, yes. And I think, however you devise a system, there's always going to be people who try to take advantage of it. And, it's probably going to be those students who have parents who've benefited from education and seen how it can change their lives, who are going to insist, although perhaps not. I mean, there's also those stories of people arriving in the UK and doing everything they can to get their children through the best possible education, and perhaps Rishi Sunak actually falls into that category too. But whatever angle people are approaching it for, you're never going to be able to devise a system that's completely fair. And I feel that this approach, where you are looking at somebody's educational background and trying to slightly separate out how much of their academic success is down to their own personal ability and application, and how much has been sort of drawn out of them by a highly practiced and potentially expensive school. That has to be a good approach. It's also inevitably going to be a slightly blunt approach, and you're never going to have a completely there's just never going to be a way that allows you to separate out those two things perfectly.
Abdul, you've just been listening to Holden tying himself in knots there, trying to explain this. Does it make you laugh to see an Englishman justify this? I mean, it's kind of like in every other country in the world, if you had a really high-ranking university, they would just choose the best students, wouldn't they? They wouldn't tie themselves in knots. And you could pay to get there. You could pay thousands to get there. That's how it works.
That's totally true. But the thing is, when I was listening to this, and I was thinking, what's the reason behind this? Why did this university wanted to include more students from state-run school? And the reason is that because they want to diversify students. They want to have diversity and inclusion. The problem is most universities and businesses, especially private sector, they do it the cheap way. They bring people just because they look different, and it's like, okay, we have solved diversity just to check boxes. And I've been to a lot of places where I applied for a job, and I was benefiting from this. I was always the diversity candidate. I tick all the boxes. Are you a minority, or are you a refugee? Are you this and this? Yes, you're qualified. just because of my background. So the problem here is to really solve this problem is to have equality, diversity, and inclusion officers where they go beyond the rural versus urban and socioeconomic levels and include people, because include people in the decision rooms and who we should hire based on merit, not based on just their social economical background.
I mean, beyond university, just going back to the school itself, Felicity, I suppose this really comes down to, like, if you're struggling to follow this story, because it taps into lots of areas, as we're suggesting, it really sort of boils down to, is it still a privilege to go to private school or not? The reason people pay for private schools is they think they're buying their children privilege. That is the only reason you do it. Is it still money well spent if you're not going to get into Oxford or Cambridge?
I suppose I guess it's one of those stories that until it affects you, I wonder whether like the true state of how it all works, because I don't have kids who are at school age, but I was quite surprised when I was reading the comments underneath the Guardian piece, bearing in mind that it's the Guardian, that there seemed to actually be a lot of sympathy with parents who are doing this. From parents who are saying, I chose a private education for my daughter, not because I wanted to or because that suits my ideological beliefs, but because the local state system is oversubscribed, it's falling to bits. Within my area, if we could scrape enough money to get them into a private school, that was far away and the best. Some private schools, it's sort of, you need to judge it, I suppose, on where you live and your catchment area and all that sort of thing, and whether your children have special needs or needs a smaller classroom, all that sort of thing. I do think there's a perception when we're talking about this, and certainly in Francis Ryan's piece, it is very, very sarky and sort of tongue-in-cheek, that when we're talking about private schools, it's sort of little boys wearing boating hats who, go off to these ridiculous institutions that, when Keir Starmer was talking in that clip just then about they have a rifle club, and it's not all. I don't think private schools are all like that, and I sort of agree with Abdul, really. I mean, we should just get away with this completely, and you should just have blind applications. You don't need to know candidates. I mean, for data, it's interesting to know, we should know, but in terms of getting a pupil into university, you shouldn't need to know their sex, their race, what school they went to. It should be entirely meritocratic and based on whether they're good enough.
That's the theory, isn't it? But in practice, Holden, when that happens, you're going to end up with a higher proportion of private school students getting into Oxford and Cambridge because they have been educated to a higher standard, because they've got smaller classes, they have better facilities, they've been coached into how to do the interview. How do you possibly avoid that?
Yeah, and I think that was borne out in the figures you saw 20, 30 years ago. I should declare an interest here in that I went to a state comprehensive school and then Cambridge. And at the time I was there, the figures they gave were that although state students on average had slightly lower A-level results on entry, they tended to leave with better degrees at the end of their 3 years. And I suppose there's two potential reasons for that. One is that a slightly lower standard of student was able to get the best possible grades at a private school because they were being better coached to pass those exams. The other possibility is actually that a state education was better preparing students for a university type degree where you're much more kind of self-directing and it's sort of more, those students end up more reliant. And it could be a mixture of those two. But I think clearly there is going to be a difference in the quality of education that the range of applicants you get has been through. And so if you're looking for the most talented students, A-level results are not necessarily going to be the sole guide to that. I do also think, though, that not all private schools are better than all state schools. There's a huge range of capability within each of those groups. So,
well, this is the thing. It's often about choice, isn't it? This is what Felicity was hinting at. Some parents send their kids to fee-paying schools simply because, they've got a nice swimming pool and they don't care about whether they get into any university at the end of it. That's not why they chose to send them there. They're sending them there for some other reason that's different to what the state sector's offering.
It will be interesting to see if this, if it becomes widely believed that going to a private school does reduce your chances of getting into Oxford, which I don't think is true, but let's say that becomes accepted. If that reduces demand for private schooling, then I think you could say that, clearly that's that has been the main reason that parents have been choosing those schools. But I suspect there's a much broader range of reasons, one of which probably is quite class-based and class-band, and it's more about the sort of person you're going to be turning out. But then, in other cases, it might be that there's a particular specialism that a school has. And I think some of the reforms you've seen in state education over the past 20 to 30 years have been trying to bring some of that specialism and range of choice into the state sector too.
If people are tiger parents, if they are cheating the system, is it worth trying to stop that happening? Does it double down on the unfairness for the brightest pupils that were state educated, that then in their sixth form someone gets parachuted in from a private school and then takes their place?
Well, it's not really unfair, because at the end of the day, the privately educated students did not really do anything wrong. The problem is with the system that is designed this way. So what can be done in here is that changing the system. Well, how do we change the system? Well, better funding to schools. If we're not paying the 350 million pounds to the EU anymore, and the NHS is not getting this money, so who is getting it? Where is this money that we're not paying the EU?
Well, I mean, the simplest way to look at it, Holden, is as they do in some countries where private schools just aren't really a thing. They legally exist, but they're not really a thing because the state schools are better.
There's an argument too that if more children of middle-class parents had to go to state education, there'd be more political pressure to make those schools better.
Certainly be more money at the PTA, wouldn't there?
Yeah, there would be for lots of reasons, both in terms of funding individual schools and political pressure for structural change. I think it would make a difference. But I do think that private schools are so established a part of British life and British education that's not really a realistic change. However much of a ideological or even moral argument there is for trying to level everything in the education system, and if you were setting up a system from scratch, that's probably what you would aim for. I just don't think there's much point in wasting political capital on that kind of argument, because it's going to have really substantial negative effects in the short term, and it's going to create a huge amount of anger, and it's going to stop you doing a lot more creative things that you could do more easily and more successfully.
Okay. Well, every day's an education here on The Week Unwrapped. That is it for now. You've all graduated. My thanks to Holden, Felicity and Abdul. You can follow this show for free, just like state education. Get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. And you can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.